Hello, everyone. I'm Nairi from Low Carbon Fasting. Our guest today is Graham Phillips from my end of the woods. Graham is from London. He is a pharmacist. He's a registered pharmacist, fellow of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. Graham has 35 years of experience, and he's also the founder of iHeart Pharmacy Group, as well as ProLongevity, that stands for or that promotes precision nutrition. Welcome to Low Carbon Fasting, Graham.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to it.
Graham, tell us more about your ventures. Well, iHeart Pharmacy Group and also ProLongevity. I like what it promotes. It promotes precision nutrition. It's brilliant.
Sure. So I started off, and I very much still am a community pharmacist. My first pharmacy was in St Albans in Hertfordshire, and then over time we built up a chain. I never expected to go beyond that, but we built up a group of 10 pharmacies. And then I played a number of very senior roles in my profession, including helping to establish the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. So the Pharmaceutical Society is the Royal College for Pharmacy. So as a result of that, I met most of the senior members of my profession, but also members of other professions. So I got to know some of the senior nurses, and in particular, people at the top of the NHS, people at the top of Public Health England, and some very inspiring GPs. And I as we grew the pharmacy group, I became research active, and although 10 is, we obviously can't compare the numbers with Boots and Lloyd's with hundreds of pharmacies, but we ended up with a sort of national reach because we were research active, because we were great innovators, and we were trying to lead and be the future. We did lots of innovation, and I kind of built the model of my pharmacies on a high performing GP practice because I'd worked with lots of GPs, I'd been a prescribing advisor, I'd been involved in the various rearrangement of the deck chairs of the NHS and all the restructuring. Don't even go there. Um, and I realised that you could you could go to a GP practice with fantastic practice management, with five GPs, with let's say, a list of 10,000 patients, and brilliant practice management, a group of GPs working synergistically, GPs with special interests, really enjoying their practice and doing fantastic work for their patients. And you could go 5 miles down the road to a building with five GPs in it with no practice management. Actually, the GPs are all working in isolation, don't get very well, don't like each other very much, and are providing indifferent services. And I realized that being in a group practice with modern communications isn't really about being physically located in the same building. Because if you have a co-location of professional ideas, then whether you're in the clinical room next door emailing each other, or whether you're in a pharmacy 5 miles away or 10 miles away, makes no real difference. So I kind of decided to recreate Manor Pharmacy Group as it was then when we had our 10 branches as a group practice of pharmacists. With me, as you like, I was like the senior partner, just as a senior partner would be in GPs. And we started to work together, work synergistically, identify and share best practice, get research active, involve ourselves in the wider health economy. And as a result of that, and my broader experience, we developed this innovative practice, and we won every single pharmacy award, and most of them twice, which is fantastic. But I reached the point where I thought, do you know what? It feels like everyone's either taking a statin or an antidepressant. Many people are taking both. So we're medicating an entire society. That doesn't make sense to me. And all I could see was I'm spooning. You start off as a fresh-faced young professional thinking you're going to do the best for patients and clients, and we did do that. But we're spooning more and more people into more and more drugs into people. The people are not getting any healthier. The drugs bill's going up and up. Everyone's morale is going downwards. And I just thought something is wrong about our treatment paradigm. And I also had a parallel health journey. So I was a fat kid, and I was a fat kid when all the kids in class were slim. Two generations on, the kids now, the slim kid in the class is the odd one out, and the fat kid is the norm. Now, either something fundamental has happened, either we've all suddenly become pigs in two generations, and there's no evidence to support that, or something has fundamentally changed in our genomics to make us fat. And we know that the human genome is remarkably stable and it takes hundreds of thousands of years to change, or something else. And I realized, because I went back and re-explored the science, that the something else has got to do with lifestyle. And in the UK, we are the highest consumers of ultra processed foods in Europe. 60+% of our calories come from ultra processed foods. Not quite as high as the Americans, but you can clearly see a link between all these inflammatory diseases: diabetes type 2, cardiovascular disease, cancer and dementia, the big killer diseases that we all dread, and in fact infertility in young women, all have a relationship. And we know that we find them in clusters, but within health systems, what we do is we await the symptoms and we try and suppress the symptoms with drugs. And we know nothing about root causes. So almost no health professionals have got any training in nutrition or exercise or sleep. So we know nothing about root cause and everything about the symptoms and the use of drugs.
So, Graham, what is the root cause of all these diseases that you mentioned that we prescribe medication for routinely? Yeah. What's the root cause?
So essentially it goes like this. At any one time, your entire bloodstream is designed to have one single sugar lump in it, one single spoonful of sugar in your 8 pints of blood. If you've got 2 spoonfuls of sugar in your entire 8 pints of blood, you've got type 2 diabetes. And the principle here is one of homeostasis, very tight control of the internal environment of the cell. And that would be true for your blood pressure, the pH of your blood, your hydration, and the amount of sugar in your blood. And we certainly know that high levels of blood glucose are toxic. And I think we're at the point now where the NHS is actually removing 40,000 limbs a year due to out of control type 2 diabetes. And do you know what the single most common acute cause of hospital admissions for kids of 7, 8 and 9 is?
Kidney disease, is it?
No, it's dental extraction, because they're
dental
going to due to sugar. And if you look back 100 years ago, there was no cancer, there was no diabetes, there was no dementia. These are brand new man-made diseases driven by ultra-processed food in the diet, particularly driven by a combination of the seed oils or vegetable oils and the sugar. And that is I call it the trifecta of evil: sugar, carbs, and seed oils. And it drives huge metabolic dysfunction. And that metabolic dysfunction has a similar cause, but it plays out in different ways in different people. So some people will get cardiovascular disease, some people will get cancer, some people will get dementia. Unlucky people get all of those.
Yes, and type 2 diabetes, of course.
Absolutely. Metabolic syndrome. Yeah.
Fascinating. So ProLongevity, you run a group called ProLongevity. Tell us more about it, because it stands for Precision Nutrition. I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah. So if it was as simple as, you've probably heard of this thing called the glycemic index.
Yes.
The glycemic index is an average. And in theory will give you 2 slices of bread is the same as so much potato, is the same as so much cake, is the same as much rice, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so they're all equivalent. And broadly speaking, that's true. But there's also a principle in science of statistics of a bell-shaped curve. If you feed an identical meal to 1,000 people, on average, you get the glycemic index. But if you're on this end of the curve or that end of the curve, you get equal and opposite reactions to identical meals. So it's not as simple as saying, don't eat the toast, don't eat the potatoes, don't eat the rice. Because one person will eat that two slices of toast and get a huge sugar spike, but have no reaction to the potatoes. And somebody else will have a huge sugar spike with the toast and nothing with the potatoes. And what we know from twin studies, identical twin studies, and from animal studies is the major determinant of your individual glycemic response. In other words, what decides for you, not your next door neighbor or your aunt or your uncle or even your partner, what determines how you will respond in terms of your sugar to any meal or combination of foods is the microbiome, the bugs in your gut. And that is very, very individual or on an n equals 1 basis. And once you understand that you get these equal and opposite reactions to identical foods, the answer is our course of what we call precision nutrition. In other words, we identify for you which foods spike your sugars and which ones don't. Which foods that you enjoy are good for you and which foods that you enjoy are not. And we gradually build up a picture of put these foods to one side and concentrate on those foods. But it's not, what we don't do is try and annihilate an entire food group. So there are only 3 macronutrients, right? Carbs, protein and fat. If you demonize an entire food group, which is what tends to happen, every time, I mean, this is what's happened over history, right? Every time sugar has had a fight, it's won. Sugar and smoking had a fight, sugar won. Sugar and fat had a fight, sugar won. Right? Sugar and salt had a fight, sugar won. Sugar always comes out the winner because they're such good lobbyists. And actually the sugar is probably the biggest demon of the lot.
So you did mention precision nutrition, how different people react differently to different foods. I guess the best way to measure their sort of how they're reacting certain foods is by giving them blood glucose monitor or even a continuous glucose monitor, a CGM. I'm proudly wearing one here. It's not visible at the moment.
You have the Libre.
I have the Libre. I've been wearing it since 2017.
You're well ahead of the curve then.
I haven't tried any other brands, but it does the job fairly well. So which ones do you use with your patients?
I think the Libre is a fantastic device, and we started off with the Libre device and we use that quite a lot. We also like the Medtrim device, and we think there are some benefits on either one. And Medtrim have just recently announced the Nano, which doesn't require any finger pricks. But it doesn't really matter. What we did was we repurposed this device. So as you well know, as a type 1 diabetic, these devices are seen in the context of type 1 diabetes. So maybe we should go into a discussion around the difference between type 1 and type 2, but I'll leave you to come back to that if you want to. In type 1 diabetes, of course, you have no insulin. So you have no ability to control your sugar. But you've still got glucagon production. So your liver is busy producing more sugar, but the insulin is not there to do the counter-regulatory activity. So it's absolutely a crucial importance to lower your carb content and then to balance your insulin. The same is true of type 2, except in type 2 diabetes, you end up secreting more and more and more and more insulin in a forlorn attempt by your body to control your sugars. Eventually your body becomes insulin resistant, your insulin doesn't work as well, and it's that hyperinsulinemia, it's that permanently raised insulin that drives all the processes. It drives the hypertension, the cardiovascular disease, the cancer, the dementia, and also polycystic ovarian syndrome. So once you understand for any one individual which foods spike their sugars because you're giving them a continual blood glucose monitor and you understand the science, you can start chipping away at the bad foods and accelerating the good foods. And it's got nothing to do with calories or cholesterol or eat less, move more. It's on a completely different paradigm.
So the whole purpose here is to keep insulin low. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, I'm a big fan of Peter Attia. I follow his podcast, and I think it was he that said, if in the length of a tweet you wanted to say what is the one thing to live a long and healthy life, it's secrete the minimum amount of insulin over a lifetime. Of course, this is perfectly equally true of type 1 diabetes as well.
Yes.
And you'll know that most type 1 diabetics are told eat carbs, inject insulin, eat more carbs, inject more insulin. And most type 1s end up dosing way super physiological doses of insulin to control their sugars, end up with insulin resistance, and end up with type 2 diabetes on top of their type 1.
Yeah. Ben Bickman recently was referring to this as double diabetes.
Yeah.
It's something that scares me because I don't have any other cases of type 1 diabetes in my family, but my family history is rich with type 2 diabetes. So I'm predisposed probably to developing type 2 diabetes as well, if not careful. So my aim is to keep my insulin intake as low as possible and maintain normal blood sugars. And the only way I can do that is by lowering my carbs. There's no other way. I mean, I've tried everything recommended to me. There's no other way to keep insulin as low as possible.
No, that's right. You've probably discovered even with type 1 diabetes that not all carbs are the same and you get much worse spikes with one carb than another, I would guess.
Correct. And even the same sort of carb, the same food at different times of the day, or whether I've had a good sleep the previous night, whether my cortisol levels are high or low, and there are so many variables. So good control of blood sugars is I recently tweeted that it is a full-time job, and I meant it. It can be a full-time job.
In type 1, it certainly is. It's a tough disease, and I feel very strongly that because when people hear diabetes, they kind of only hear type 2. And I feel that type 1 diabetics have a much tougher time of it. They don't get the support that they should have. They're told all the wrong version of the science, and they don't get their share of voice. But what's interesting, so as you will know, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the body starts to attack itself.
Yes.
And just as we're seeing massive growth in type 2 and all the other aspects of metabolic syndrome, cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and so on, although autoimmune disease at a much lower level, it's growing at a rapid pace, right? So why, after 2 million years of evolution, would our body start to attack itself? And why is that growing rapidly in a generation or two? And I think it's the same root cause, which is basically related to ultra-processed food in the diet.
Fascinating.
And the effect it has on the gut. So 85% of your immunity is in your gut. And the integrity of the gut lining is maintained by the microbiome, the bugs in your gut.
And I think this is where precision nutrition plays a big role, because none of us have exactly the same kind of microbiome, do we? We're all different.
We're very different. It's quite interesting. So genetically, we're all sixth cousins, according to Tim Spector, who knows these things. But even where you've got identical twins, right? So what we know about identical twins is that they have identical genetics, and they're brought up in the same house. So there's a debate about nature and nurture, but in a case of an identical twin, nature and nurture are the same. You might broadly assume that if one is type 1, the other one will be type 1, and that they would kind of die on the same thing on the same day. And actually, that's not true. I mean, this is where Tim Spector's twin studies are fascinating, because he's been able to show that what causes the difference, what generates these huge differences, and people who are identical genetic clones, again, it's the microbiome. So I believe that two things will revolutionize the practice of medicine in the next 10 years. One is the understanding of the role of insulin and that relationship between insulin, glucagon, and all the other hormones. And the other one is our growing understanding of the role of the microbiome. Basically, it's ignored till now because we didn't know about it.
But medical science is changing. It's transitioning faster than perhaps 10 years ago. What was interesting was that talking about going back to CGMs, I recently purchased one from my local pharmacy and put one on my mother for the first time. My mom is 77.
Yep.
She's not diabetic, pre-diabetic, yes, but she's not diabetic yet. And I put one on her, and it was fascinating to see, for her actually quite shocking to see which foods caused her to spike, caused her blood sugars to spike. It was interesting, and that's all she needed, just 15 days of CGM experience to learn about what foods to avoid. Now she won't eat bread. She just doesn't eat bread because bread causes her blood sugars to rise as fast as perhaps sugar would.
No, that's right. What if you have a bit more time to look it into details? So I find that most of my clients relatively happy to give up potatoes and rice and flour, but a lot of them really struggle to give up bread. I mean, I
Bread.
love bread. What I've been able to do is, so where I've got a client who really loves bread, we will try 20 or 30 different breads with 5 or 6 fillings.
Mm.
And you can often find a bread that doesn't spike or spikes only marginally. So there are little hacks and tricks that allow you to get away with it. Another thing that's quite interesting with bread, and this applies pretty much to all the white carbs, is if you freeze it and reheat it, it restructures the starch, and you then get a much higher amount of insoluble starch. And then
Fascinating.
you don't get the sugar spikes.
I've heard something similar about rice.
Same with rice and potatoes. Yep.
I haven't tried it though. It'll be
Yeah.
worth a try.
I'd say to your mum, get the bread, chop it up, put it in the freezer, and then if you fancy a piece of bread, you can just toast it. And I'm not saying if you find the right bread, you'd be surprised how much that attenuates the sugar spikes.
It's fascinating. So you do use CGMs with your patients to get good data. What?
I think CGM is key, but I also think you've got to be really careful of obsessing about one metric.
Hmm.
So we look at sleep, and a lot of
Yes.
our clients have the Aura Ring. In fact, I've just ordered a new Aura Ring for myself, or about this. This is the finger, the ring, the sizing ring for an Aura Ring. So that's, I don't know if you're familiar with the Aura Ring sleep device.
Uh, no, tell us more about it.
Well, sleep is of such fundamental importance. And I'll give you kind of a couple of examples. So, um, if you're short slept, and most of us are, most of the people in this country are not sleeping well and they're not sleeping with good quality. You will be permanently, so your body, it will spike the sort of because we've got no adaptation for short sleep. Your body interprets that as a stress response.
Mm.
So if you're short of sleep, you'll be running on adrenaline
Mm-hmm.
and cortisol,
Yes.
and then you'll be running much higher sugars, and then you'll
Mm-hmm.
be running much higher insulin, and then you're on the route to diabetes. And it's a couple of quite interesting things. So not only do we sleep as an organism, not only do our individuals sleep individually, but the organelles within cells sleep. And when we're asleep, the microbiome regenerates in a completely different way. Insulin changes. I mean, they're really, really fundamental things. So if you ignore sleep, you're literally building your house of health on sand.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of other interesting examples. In fact, I'll give you three. Um, as you know, whales are mammals.
Mm-hmm.
If a whale fell asleep at the bottom of the sea, it would drown because they have to come up for air. So when whales sleep, they sleep with one side of the brain and then the other. And the same thing is true of the migratory birds. So, you know, the migratory birds who are on the wing for several days, you know, they're kind of in you've got a lead bird and then they take it in turns.
Mm-hmm.
The birds also, not the one at the front, but the birds in the back of the flock will take it in turns to sleep with one side of their brain and then the other. Otherwise, they'd fall out of the sky, right?
Yes.
So sleep is, I mean, I could go on and on, but sleep is of absolutely fundamental importance. So we spend a lot of time with our clients looking at sleep, and where people have got the aura rings, we can look very specifically at their sleep
Mm.
data. So sleep, stress, exercise. So it's precision lifestyle. It's not nutrition is the most important aspect, but it's not the only aspect. And much as sugar and insulin are important, we need to also think about nutrition, and energy and nutrition are not the same thing. So really about guiding people through all this complexity and identifying for them which are the most important levers to pull, how hard to pull them, and then pull the next and the next and the next in a sequential series. And that's why we like it to be a 6 or 12 month program, because you
Mm.
can't address this in 5 minutes.
Yes, sleep. I know from myself, my own experience. If I haven't slept well, next morning, I not only wake up with higher blood sugars,
Yep.
but insulin that I inject, well, I actually wear a pump, Omnipod pod,
Oh,
insulin pod.
well, yeah.
Insulin doesn't seem to work. So I suddenly find myself insulin resistant. I just inject more and then nothing is happening, but blood sugars
Yeah.
aren't coming down. So I'm
Poor
basically,
sleep.
I would stay insulin resistant
That's
for
exactly
the
right.
entire morning.
Yeah. Yeah. And then do you find that you're hungrier as well?
Um, I haven't noticed that, but that's something to watch out for now you mentioned it.
I certainly notice it. If I've, I mean, I used to be proud about not sleeping. I used to think sleep was, you plenty of time to sleep when you're dead.
Mm.
And I've now completely changed my mind now, and I'm thinking you will be dead.
Mm.
So I used to really deprioritize sleep as a young man. I now make it a maximum priority. And I know that if I have a bad night's sleep, I don't just feel terrible, I'm far hungrier. And I find it far harder to resist the charms of the processed food and eat the healthy
Mm.
food. And it's because your brain, from a sort of evolutionary biology perspective, the only time we ever short slept is when we were hungry.
Mm.
Your brain thinks that your body's starving when you're short of sleep, even though it's not. So you'll grab at the high energy dense foods.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm certainly angrier.
Yeah.
I'm in a bad mood when I haven't slept
Same.
well and my blood sugars are running high, insulin isn't working, and that's not a good feeling. That's not a good feeling at all. Mm. Okay, so how do you help your patients reverse their type 2 diabetes? Because now we know it's possible to either reverse or to put it into remission, whichever phrase you want to go
Sure.
for.
Well,
But how do you help them?
sure. So I think there's a point of principle here. We have to be very, very careful. Um, in the majority of my pre-diabetic patients, I think remission is reversal is a possibility in the majority. In other words, they're not diabetic anymore. I think once you get to the point of type 2 diabetes, there's a fundamental break of your whole metabolism, and you can put it into remission, but you can't reverse it. In other words, once you're diabetic, you're probably always diabetic. But so long as you're really careful with your diet. So, really, in many ways, the correct diet for a type 2 diabetic is the same diet as it is for a type 1 diabetic. Because although in a type 1 diabetic, there's no insulin, in a type 2 diabetic, there is insulin, but your body's ignoring it.
Mm.
So you would kind of end up in the same place. So the answer is very much to take a stepwise, incremental, and data driven approach. So we will start off looking at their lifestyle, their diet, their sleep, their nutrition, but also we try and get very good data. So we'll look at blood pressure in a very forensic way. We'll look at their lipid profile, their cholesterol, and particularly look at liver function tests. And I've got pretty adept at reading all of those. So I can kind of see where they are as a baseline. And then we go stepwise. So what we don't do is try and make too many changes at once. We will pick what we think, with the agreement of the client, is the most important thing for them. And a lot of my clients will come to me worried about their blood pressure, and actually they're sleeping really badly. And I'll say, look, we should prioritize your sleep, because we prioritize sleep, you'll feel better, your insulin will come down, your sugar will come down, everything will come down, and your blood pressure will come down with it. And people don't know that. So it's about working with the client in the way that they want to achieve the outcomes that they want, but very much driven by the clinical picture, but also the data behind it. And it's bringing all that complexity together. And that's kind of where I feel we add the value.
You did mention blood pressure, people with blood pressure. I guess a lot of type 2 diabetics also have higher blood pressure.
Okay.
Do you find them coming off their blood pressure medication when they adopt a low carbohydrate lifestyle?
You know, I said whenever sugar has a fight, sugar always wins.
Mm-hmm.
So when sugar had a fight with sodium, salt, right, sugar won.
Yes.
And we've spent the last 40 years blaming salt for what the insulin did as a result of the sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And we know, for example, that when people have when they have gastric bypass, so these people can be 200-300 pounds overweight. They have a gastric band or a gastric bypass. And within a month, they've lost, I don't know, a small amount of weight, 20 pounds. They're still 180 pounds overweight, but their blood pressure comes straight down. It can't be about the weight, right? The weight loss is insignificant. What's bringing down their blood pressure is they're bringing down their insulin. And insulin raises blood pressure in about 5 different ways. So one of the first things to happen with our clients as they start to improve is their blood pressure comes down, and it comes down much before their weight. Because we bring their insulin down rapidly, and it's the insulin that's driving their hypertension. But almost no clinicians know that.
No, and that's a tough one, because I guess you experienced that some of your patients perhaps go to their GP, and the GP is giving them a completely different advice, and then they come to you and they hear a completely different narrative. How do you tackle that? How do you address that? It's a tough one.
It is a tough one. So I've worked with GPs all my life as a community pharmacist. My partner's a GP. I'm not here to knock them. I've done a lot of education sessions with GPs. Again, if you go to my website, you can see some of them. It's very much about working. I mean, not all GPs are cooperative, but as a principle and as a starting point, it's absolutely to work with the patient and the GP as a team. So I'm very, very keen on teamwork. And initially, some of the GPs are very skeptical, of course, but as they start to see their patients improve, you start getting calls saying, I was impressed by that, Graham. How did you do that? And I say, would you fancy having a go at it? So we've had a lot of health professionals as clients, because you kind of would imagine, wouldn't you, that health professionals would be healthier than the rest. But health professionals are just as fat and just as sick as the rest of society, because we have no training in all of this stuff. But I'll tell you one thing, doctors are very, very bright people. And once you kind of explain it to them, they get it very quickly, and then they fly. And I love doing that. So as much as I can, I want to work in partnership with the GP, but ultimately my responsibility is to my patient and my client, and I'll always do what's best for them. And if that involves a level of conflict, reluctantly, that's what I do.
Fascinating. I mean, my own GP surgery, when I'm registered with, are now trained. All the GPs are trained in low carbohydrate lifestyle, and I'm interviewing. I have a special guest next week interviewing her to tell us about how she's training GPs across the UK. So they're better informed to help their patients adopt a low carbohydrate sort of diet. But it is a lifestyle. You're right. Let's talk about exercise. So what kind of exercise do you recommend to your patients?
So again, it's not a very individual N=1 kind of basis, but a lot of people do well. So if you think about human evolution, and if you think about the blue zones where people live in fantastic health to be 100, what does it tell us? Human beings are designed to move. If you notice, I'm speaking to you standing up because I've got a standing desk, and I've got this watch, and I've been sitting around for too long. It gives me a nudge and say, "Oi, Graham, you need to move your bum." So one of the principles is to get people to stand up a lot more. And so, for example, when I meet with my team and we have business meetings, we have standing up meetings. And what I find is there's much more energy in the room. we get through the agenda much faster. Our meetings are a lot shorter. So I try to get people to sort of follow two or three principles. One is that the established, a lot of people are worried about dementia now. That's the kind of, if you ask people what worries them most, it used to be cancer. But as we're getting better and better at sort of treating cancer, it's now dementia. And the evidence for exercise and dementia is pretty strong. One is lots of walking, and the other one is high intensity exercise. I'm talking about exercise that you get so breathless you couldn't hold a conversation. So, for example, if we go up to London, and my favourite tube station, I think, is Covent Garden, that's got nearly 200 steps. And when I first started, I got to step 10, and then I sort of had a heart attack and fell back down, but not really. I can now do all 200 steps without too much of a problem. So by the time everybody else, they look at you like you're mad, but they're still in the queue for the lift, and I'm at the top. So a combination of high intensity exercise, some low level movement, which we're designed to do, and also some resistance training, because particularly this is true of men. As men age, we tend to become sarcopenic, and so you end up with little fat bellies and stick-like arms and legs.
Yes.
So it's all about maintaining muscle mass. And the way
Hmm.
to maintain muscle mass is resistance exercise. So weights, right? Now, that doesn't mean going to a gym, although it might. You can use your body weight to do that very effectively. So I try to encourage people to do whatever form of resistance exercise is going to float their boat, combined with some high intensity and lots of regular movement.
I do that with a few dumbbells I've purchased. I do it at home. I don't go to the gym, and resistance bands, and I have an effective workout, 15
Yeah.
minutes every morning.
Even they've shown this in studies with older men, um, just just getting a resistance, one of these things where you grip,
Hmm.
even grip strength is a huge predictor of future health.
Right,
And there
right.
are two or three other things that you can look at. One is your ability to actually sit down on the floor like that and get back up again without using your arms.
Mm.
That's a huge predictor. Another one is, can you stand with your eyes closed on one leg, and how long can you do that for?
Uh-huh.
And those kind of small things tell you a great deal about someone's health. And then there's this other one called VO2 max, which is your ability to maximal consumption of oxygen. So
Hmm.
two or three small things give you a lot of information, and I get people to focus on those.
You did mention men with stick thin legs and bigger bellies, and yet
Yeah.
if you put these men, or there may be women as well, on a traditional scale and check their
Yeah,
BMI, they would
their
come up,
mind's fine and they don't look fat. Sure.
and it wouldn't alarm their GPs. I mean, most GPs wouldn't be alarmed.
I think BMI, I've written a blog about it, that we think BMI, I'm not saying it's completely useless, but if you pick a rugby player, they'll have a massive BMI,
Mm.
right? The point is that you've got, to me, I use height to weight ratio, waist to height ratio is what I use. So your waist should be less than half your height. And that will, for those stick like men, it won't be.
Mm.
So,
Mhm.
and also, as I say to clients, I had a client come on the other day and she said, I've lost 40 inches. What I get my clients to do is to measure around the neck, round the bust, round the belly, and the top of each thigh.
Uh-huh.
And she hadn't lost that much weight, but she'd lost 40 inches in total.
That's
And often
brilliant.
shape changes much more rapidly than weight. If your stomach's getting smaller, then you're doing it right, kind of irrespective of what anything else shows.
So muscle, you did mention muscle strengthening exercises. So it is important, it is healthy to strengthen our muscles. Um, how do muscles or stronger muscles protect our bones? So what's the relation? Because we know that the best way to avoid, breakages as we age is to have stronger muscles. Tell
Well,
us more about it.
the muscles themselves aren't protecting the bones, but the effect of the exercise, particularly weight-bearing exercise and percussive exercise, does. Sitting around for a long time, particularly if you sit around for a long time and you've got heartburn and you're taking proton pump inhibitors all
Mm.
the time. It's a great way to, damage your bones. So, and also you've got to think about nutritional status. So, I've got a lot of, the NHS guidance for vitamin D, for example, is a tiny irrelevant dose. And I get people, my typical dose will be 10 times higher than the NHS guidelines. But I always say take it with K2, because one of the things that vitamin D does is it controls, it recruits calcium. You want to recruit the calcium into your bones, but not your arteries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know that. So we always dose K2 with vitamin D.
Right. And how much of it would you mind sharing that with us? So how much?
Again, it's very much dependent. So we try, in an ideal world, we'd measure vitamin D and then dose based on the measurement.
Mm.
But generally speaking, 3 to 4,000 units a day
Yeah.
for most people.
Mm-hmm.
But that, I've got people who are having 10,000 units a day and they're still on the low level.
Mm.
The other point is this, about vitamin D. Much as I believe in, the science is fairly good science around vitamin D. It doesn't replace sunlight.
No.
So the whole kind of health infrastructure, which is abstracting the entire health into one thing, doesn't work. So yes, you can get some vitamin D, and yes, we should all supplement, particularly in the UK where you just can't get the right amount of the right rays. Don't think that replaces sunlight, because it doesn't. Get decent sun exposure.
That's why we need our annual holidays in sunny places.
Well, the kind of risk of that is people then go crazy and get sunburned.
Burnt, yes. Completely burnt, actually.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that's not good.
No.
What we really want is regular exposure.
Graham, we talked about sort of exercise in general and diet. Now, our channel is called Low Carbon Fasting. I have been doing intermittent fasting for 21 years. I also did a longer fast, being a type 1 diabetic. I wrote a blog about it as well. Longer fast, which is a 90-hour fast, recently. I personally see the benefits of it. So what's where do you stand with fasting?
So I think I go stepwise. So if you go to somebody who's had a typical carby diet,
Mm.
and ask them to fast, they'll have a huge reactive hypoglycemia. They'll feel terrible. They'll pass out, and they'll never do it again. So I think you have to prepare the body. So the principle is this: the body has the ability to burn two sorts of fuel. It can burn sugar or it can burn fat. If there's sugar around, it will preferentially burn the sugar. And people think, well, that must mean it's our natural fuel. It isn't because of that. It's because the body knows that the sugar is toxic and will get rid of it. So the first principle is to get people fat adapted. In other words, they can move seamlessly. I describe it a bit like a hybrid car. When the battery goes flat in your hybrid car, it doesn't grind to a halt. The engine kicks in and you don't even know, right? So that it's always balancing the two things, and it can use either fuel to propel the vehicle. And that's how human beings are designed to be. So you've got two forms of energy storage in your body, glycogen and fat. And your glycogen stores are about 2,000 calories. And most people, it'll run your body for about 24 hours. What most people are doing is they're continually topping up their glucose, continually topping up their insulin, and they're continually overfilling their glycogen stores. And then they're pushing extra energy into their fat stores. But their insulin is permanently high in a forlorn attempt, as I said earlier on, to try and control their blood glucose. When your insulin is high, your fat is locked away and you can't access it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you've got high insulin and you don't eat, you will have that terrible hypo, that gnawing hunger, all of those sort of feelings. And it's the same thing about the marathon runners who talk about hitting the wall. They have a profound hypo. They can't access their fat stores because a lot of marathon runners, all the time, they're putting more sugar in their system, and they're slim and fit, so they think it's healthy, but it's not. So my process goes like this. First of all, withdraw from all the ultra processed food.
Mhm.
Then you're less hungry. Then I consolidate people's meals into 3 meals a day. So at least a breakfast, a lunch, and an evening meal, and no snacks. So now they're eating healthy nutrition, they're much less hungry, and they're not snacking. The next thing I will do is what we call time restricted feeding, and that's not fasting. So we'll basically say eat your 3 meals over a 12-hour period with gaps, and then have a 12-hour period with not eating. And that in itself brings down insulin, improves everything. Then they'll start to say, my weight's coming down, I'm feeling better, I'm feeling more energetic, I'm sleeping better, everything's improving. Where do I go next? And I'll say, are you equally hungry for every meal? And they'll say, I mean, in my case, for example, I've never been hungry for breakfast. But I believe the Kool-Aid, right, which is breakfast is the most important meal of the day, it gets your body going, etc., etc. So I would every day have a piece of toast and some marmalade for breakfast and sugar in my tea. 2 hours later, I'd be starving hungry with a
Mm.
massive energy slump, right? I'm just not hungry. I mean, I call that whole process the tyranny of food. And I
Mm.
feel like I've escaped from the tyranny of food. So I'm simply not hungry anymore. I eat when I want to eat, and I don't eat when I don't want to eat because I'm fat adapted. So when there's no sugar coming in, because my glycogen stores are not being crammed with sugar all the time, my body simply says, we'll burn some of that fat that Graham's accumulated over the last 62 years.
Mhm.
So the process then is start to skip the meals that you're not hungry for. So now you're eating 3 meals today, 2 meals the next, and mix it up. Then I get people maybe eating 1 meal a day every so often. So now on maybe 1 day a week or 2 days a week, you're eating 1 meal. Another day of the week, you're eating two, and some days you're eating three. So we're mixing it up all the time. Keep the body getting. And then I'll say, okay, how hard would it be for you to miss 2 meals and the next meal? So now you haven't eaten for 36 hours, right? I mean, you might do that twice a week, and over time, so nobody knows the science behind this. There's a kind of educated guess, but a longer period of not eating switches on all these other body processes, autophagy and apoptosis, and your body starts to go scavenging for the bad cells, demolishes them and recycles them, and those are the cells that are going to give you cancer, etc., and they're the inflammatory cells. And I kind of push most of my clients at some point to do a 5-day fast, maybe twice a year. But it might take them 6 months to get there. What I don't do is on day one say do a 5-day fast because they'll fall over.
Mhm.
But there's absolutely profound evidence to show now that the sweet spot is somewhere between 3 and 5 days of not eating.
Mm.
Plenty of fluids, plenty of hydration, plenty of salt. And most people find day 2 quite hard. By day 3, it gets quite easy. And I hate this term detox, but it's kind of the term you might think of actually in this circumstances. It is a detox. Your microbiome changes, your insulin levels drop, it gives your liver a rest, and the body now starts to turn in and look around. What's hanging around that we can recycle? Because there's no
Mm.
energy coming in. What can we recycle that's hanging around that was otherwise going to be unhealthy? And then there's a whole other layer of things called the sirtuin genes that you can activate. These are your longevity genes. So I get the premise of pro-longevity. We didn't call it diabetes reversal. It's pro-longevity, live healthier for longer.
Mhm.
Most people mistakenly assume that's about avoiding illness. But those people who work in long-term health realize that actually it's not about that. There's a whole other set of processes that build longevity. And the most profound intervention you can make is not to eat between 3 and 5 days.
Mm. I mentioned in detail in my 90-hour fasting blog the day or the exact hour where I felt intense mental clarity. You mentioned detox. Well, I didn't use the word detox either, but that mental clarity and the physical energy was something I'd never experienced before. I'll put the link in the description.
Please do. And what happened to your insulin requirements and your blood glucose over those 9 hours?
They dropped right down to 4 units, 6 units per day, which is fabulous.
I'm regularly seeing people with type 1 injecting 100, 200 units, right? Which is way beyond physiological levels. So it shows you, you can, even with type 1, and I presume you had a perfectly flat blood glucose, did you, through that time?
Perfectly. Although my Libre, because it's automatically set to label 3.9 as a hypo, whereas if you are on a low carbohydrate diet, 3.9 is not really a hypo, because you're that's your average blood sugar. So I was red on one of the days. I was like continuously red, but I didn't think of it as something negative. I felt great, actually. So next time I'm going to challenge myself to do a 100-hour fast and see how that goes and document everything.
I think that's very good. I mean, I think you had Ian Lake on the podcast.
I did have Ian Lake on the podcast, and
05100 challenge.
We talked about it. Yeah, we talked about it.
He did a brilliant Diet Doctor podcast as well. So Ian is a great example of what is possible in type 1.
He's an inspiration for all type 1s. We're going to wrap this up pretty shortly. So tell our audience, Graham, how they can reach you. You are pretty vocal on social media. I follow you on Twitter.
I love Twitter. I love Twitter for 2 or 3 reasons. One is I love the discipline of trying to condemn the whole world into sort of 140 characters or whatever it is now. I love the immediacy of it, and I just think it's a brilliant way to communicate. My Twitter handle is @Graham S. Phillips, GRAHAM for Graham, S, my middle name, Phillips with 2 L's. And for ProLongevity, it's @longevity_pro. But if you just Google Graham Phillips pharmacist, or just search on the word longevity, so ProLongevity is just longevity with pro in front of it. And that you'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, all the social media. We've got a very active Facebook group, and my website's got all my podcasts and information, lots of free information to access there.
That's brilliant. I'll put all those details in the description below. So thank you very much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. It's been great speaking to you.
Hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye now.